During the continuation war, deep in the trackless wilds of East Karelia, moved a secret group of elite soldiers whom the Red Army feared more than anything else. They were the headquarters long-range patrolmen of the legendary Detachment Marttina. In this entirely fact-based documentary, we track second by second these men's journey hundreds of kilometers behind enemy lines. This is not a story of conventional trench warfare, but a real-life survival and espionage drama. Led by Captain Paul Marttina, these guerrillas blew up enemy trains, destroyed headquarters, and gathered vital intelligence amidst the untouched wilderness. Sit back and immerse yourself in this in-depth documentary, beginning with the harsh selection and secret gear. One could not simply apply for Detachment Marttina. The men were selected by headquarters with extreme precision. They had to be mentally unbreakable and in iron physical condition. The best were border guards, foresters, and athletes who could move through the woods in complete silence and navigate without maps. Many regular soldiers broke during the early March trials. The long-range patrolman's most vital and reliable weapon was the Finnish Suomi submachine gun M-31, equipped with a large drum magazine. It was a firearm that did not jam in mud, water, or freezing cold, offering massive firepower in sudden close-quarters battles among the trees. Additionally, the men carried a silent puukko knife, hand grenades, and explosives. The patrol's most vital equipment was the secret Quinaltier radio, developed by Finnish engineers. It was exceptionally lightweight and fit into a small bag, unlike the heavy radio apparatus of other nations. With the Quinal radio, Martina's men could transmit telegraph messages from hundreds of kilometers away, directly to headquarters in Micheli. Since long-range patrols lasted for weeks, the men had to carry all their food on their backs in heavy rucksacks. Regular army rations were too heavy, so the guerrillas were equipped with special rations. The most important energy source was the famous patrol butter, mixed with massive amounts of sugar and nuts. This high-fat mix kept the men operational. The leader and soul of the detachment was Captain Paul Marttina, an experienced and cold-blooded veteran. Marttina knew the difficult terrains and untouched wilderness of East Karelia better than anyone else. He demanded absolute discipline and silent movement from his men. Martina's calm presence in difficult situations gave the men faith they would always return home. As the continuation war began in the summer of 1941, Detachment Marttina started its dangerous journeys across the border. Infiltration was executed under the cover of night, so enemy border guards would not detect the men's movements. The guerrillas marched in long single files through dense forests and sinking swamps, avoiding roads. Every man followed the shadow of the one ahead. Once the patrol had penetrated dozens of kilometers into the enemy's rear, they established a secret base or wilderness camp. The camp was positioned in a dense spruce thicket or hillside, with a clear view of the surroundings. Fires and smoking were strictly forbidden, as smoke or light would have exposed them instantly. The men took turns sleeping directly on the ground. From the camp, Martina's guerrillas initiated vital reconnaissance work. Small squads moved through the surroundings, monitoring Red Army troop movements, fortifications, and supply dumps. Observations were recorded and transmitted via the secret Quinal radio directly to headquarters. This intelligence was invaluable to Finnish frontline commanders. Although the patrols sought to avoid engagements to remain invisible, clashes were sometimes unavoidable. On an early mission, Martina's patrol ran into a Red Army supply squad on a narrow forest path. In a brief and violent firefight, the Finnish submachine guns proved superior. The enemy was quickly routed, and the guerrillas vanished back into the wild. The Murmansk railway became the primary target for Detachment Marttina. Along this vital railroad, the Soviet Union transported war weapons, ammunition, and food supplied by the Allies directly from the north to the fronts. Cutting the line was a primary order from headquarters. The guerrillas had to march for weeks, carrying dozens of kilograms of heavy explosives to reach this guarded target. The surroundings of the Murmansk railway were not unprotected. The Red Army knew the threat of Finnish long-range patrols and had fortified the tracks with dense guard posts, barbed wire fences, and minefields. Sentries patrolled the area constantly. Martina's men had to observe the track traffic and guard routines for days from hiding before they could strike. When the right moment arrived in the darkness of night, the guerrillas left their heavy rucksacks in the woods and crept onto the tracks. The action had to be precise and silent. No sparks or sounds could be made, while some men kept watch with fingers on their submachine gun triggers. Engineers installed pressure and time explosives directly under the steel rails and camouflaged the tracks. After the mission, the patrol vanished quickly back into the safety of the wilderness. Moments later, the rumble of a heavy Soviet freight train echoed from the darkness. As the locomotive drove over the Finnish line, a massive explosion followed. The engine and dozens of cars derailed in a sea of fire, destroying Allied war supplies. The track was severed, paralyzing supply for days. After the detonation, Martina's guerrillas did not always flee immediately, but stayed to harass the repair efforts. When Red Army clearing crews arrived at the scene, the Finns suddenly opened fire from the forest edge with their Suomi submachine guns. This inflicted more casualties and delayed the reopening of the track, forcing the Soviets to deploy large infantry units. As Soviet trains exploded and communication lines snapped, the Red Army command grew furious. Special destruction battalions, the Istrebiteli, were formed to hunt down the Finnish guerrillas. These elite units consisted of local wilderness soldiers and expert trackers who knew the terrain as well as the Finns. A ruthless manhunt began in the dense forests. The greatest and most terrifying enemy for Martina's men in the wilderness was not bullets, but trained enemy military dogs. Red Army pursuit detachments utilized large German shepherds that could catch the scent of the guerrillas' tracks even days later. When the distant barking of dogs echoed through the woods, the patrolmen knew they had to move without rest. To deceive the tracking dogs, Martina's guerrillas had to employ clever tactics. They walked for miles in freezing wilderness streams and shallow rivers to break their scent trail in the water. Sometimes the men scattered strong, Finnish substitute tobacco or special scent powder behind them to confuse the dogs' sensitive sense of smell, and by vital time, the pursuit could last uninterrupted for several days. Martina's men had to run and march with heavy rucksacks on their backs, without sleep or the chance to cook hot food. Stopping meant death. Due to sleep deprivation, the guerrillas began to hallucinate and fell asleep while walking, but an iron will and Martina's strict command kept them moving. Ultimately, the enemy's vanguard caught up with the Finnish patrolmen in a dense spruce thicket. The silence tore apart in seconds as Suomi submachine guns and Red Army PPSH weapons opened fire on each other. It was a brief and extremely violent meeting engagement among the trees. The Finns fired lethal bursts and immediately broke contact. As the pursuit stretched into weeks, Detachment Martina's rucksacks emptied. The vital sugar, butter, and dried meat ran out completely. The guerrillas had to endure tearing hunger while marching dozens of kilometers a day. Every step required extreme willpower as their bodies began to consume muscle. The men chewed berries, tree bark, and pine needles to keep their mouths moist. In addition to hunger, the men were tormented by the endless swamps of Viena Karelia. In midsummer, the mires turned into sinking bogs, where a man could sink up to his waist in black mud. Carrying heavy gear through such terrain was a physical hell. Crossing a single swamp could take hours, and every submersion drained the last remnants of their strength. On the hot summer swamps, the guerrillas faced the worst plague of the northern wilderness: millions of mosquitoes, midges, and horseflies. The men could not use mosquito coils or netting for fear of detection. Swarms covered the soldiers' faces and hands until they bled, making rest and aiming impossible. This constant mental and physical torment drove men to the brink. Constant cold, wet clothes, and drinking swamp water caused severe stomach illnesses and fevers among the men. However, no one was allowed to be left behind, as abandoning a wounded or sick comrade meant certain death at the hands of the enemy. Comrades were carried in turns on makeshift wooden stretchers, doubling the burden on the group. Amidst this human suffering, Captain Paul Marttina remained steadfast. When the men were ready to give up and sleep in the swamp, Marttina walked alongside the line and demanded they rise. His cold-blooded professionalism and strict, yet fatherly approach kept the detachment together. "Just one more ridge, men, and home begins there," went his famous whisper. After weeks of trekking through the wilderness, Detachment Marttina finally reached the shore of a vast wilderness lake, their designated rescue point. The pursuers had been left behind in the swamps, and the guerrillas could briefly set down their heavy rucksacks. The air was thick with exhaustion, but also unbelievable relief. They had survived. Visual reconnaissance alone was not always enough for headquarters. Sometimes an absolute order arrived to capture a live enemy soldier or officer for interrogation. These prisoner snatch missions were the most dangerous form of long-range operations. Martina's men had to creep directly into Red Army-occupied villages or quarters in the dead of night. Before the raid, the guerrillas hid at the forest edge, observing life in the Soviet village for hours. They counted the number of sentries, mapped their routes, and identified the building where the staff or officers stayed. Excitement was agonizing. Every man knew that if someone accidentally stepped on a dry twig, the whole village would awaken. When the nightly moment arrived, selected guerrillas crept silently onto the village lane under cover of darkness. They quietly neutralized outdoor sentries and breached the target house. Action had to be lightning fast. Before the sleeping Soviet officers inside could even comprehend what was happening, the Finns had bound and gagged the chosen prisoner. After a successful snatch, the hardest part of the journey began, escorting the prisoner hundreds of kilometers back to the Finnish side. The enemy immediately launched a massive pursuit upon realizing the officer was missing. The prisoner had to be guarded day and night, forced to march behind the Finns through deep snow or swamps. In addition to the prisoner, Martina's men always cleared the staff tables of all maps, codebooks, and official documents. These papers were stuffed into the guerrillas' rucksacks. Often, these secret documents proved even more valuable in headquarters investigations than the prisoners themselves, containing precise deployment data. When Detachment Martina finally reached their own lines with a terrified Soviet officer and rucksacks full of secret documents, the intelligence they brought saved the lives of thousands of Finnish soldiers. The prisoner and papers were immediately delivered to the Michele intelligence staff. Martina's men had proven their unmatched skill. In 1942, Detachment Martina received one of its most demanding missions from headquarters. They had to infiltrate exceptionally deep into the enemy's rear, to the remote region of Lake Laviarvi. The goal was to cut the Red Army's new supply routes and destroy large supply dumps. The mission was so long and hazardous that the men knew they would be on their own for weeks. The journey to Laviarvi demanded unbelievable physical endurance from the guerrillas. The men marched hundreds of kilometers through the untouched forests, steep hills, and dark swamps of Viena Karelia. Every man carried a rucksack weighing over 30 kilograms on his back, packed with explosives and rations. Their feet bled, but the marching pace could not slow for a moment. Upon reaching the Laviarvi sector, Martina's guerrillas launched a lightning strike on a guarded Red Army supply base. The surprise was absolute. The fire from Suomi submachine guns tore through the darkness, and before the enemy could form a defense, Finnish engineers had already placed explosives in the supply stores. Massive detonations lit up the night sky. Following the successful raid, the Red Army alerted massive reinforcements, and Martina's patrol found themselves surrounded on the lake shore. The situation looked desperate. However, Captain Martina kept his cool. He led his men in a fierce breakthrough through enemy lines during the darkest hour of the night. With hand grenades, the guerrillas shattered the encirclement. The Great Laviarvi expedition went down in history as one of the most successful and hazardous long-range patrol operations of the continuation war. Detachment Martina proved that no target in the enemy's rear was safe from Finnish guerrillas. Upon returning to their own lines, the men were emaciated and exhausted, but they had fulfilled the order. As long-range patrols stretched for hundreds of kilometers, the greatest fear was being wounded. If a guerrilla took a bullet to the leg in a firefight deep in the Viena wilderness, he could not be left behind. However, carrying a comrade on a stretcher through swamps slowed the patrol down so much that destruction battalions caught up quickly. They had to radio for air rescue. A specialized unit, Flight Detachment Malinen, was established to rescue the long-range patrols. These Finnish pilots were recklessly brave men who flew German Heinkel He-59 seaplanes under cover of darkness deep into Soviet airspace. Their mission was to land on unmapped wilderness lakes, surrounded by the enemy, and retrieve Martina's men safely. Landing on a Soviet lake demanded absolute precision. The roar of the aircraft engines instantly exposed them to nearby enemy patrols. As the Heinkel taxied along the lake surface to the shore, Martina's guerrillas rushed from the shadows, carrying their wounded comrades. Meanwhile, the aircraft gunners held the enemy at bay. Every second was a gamble. Once the wounded and exhausted men were pulled inside the aircraft, the pilots slammed the throttle forward. Often, Red Army soldiers reached the shore just before takeoff and opened a fierce hail of rifle and submachine gun fire toward the rising seaplane. Bullets tore the plane's thin surfaces, but brave pilots pulled the aircraft into the sky. Just a few hours after the guerrillas had been surrounded in mortal danger, deep inside enemy territory, the rescue plane landed safely on a Finnish lake on the home front. The wounded were immediately transferred to waiting ambulances. The perfect cooperation between Flight Detachment Malinen and Detachment Martina saved dozens of elite lives. In September 1944, the continuation war ended in a heavy armistice. The Moscow Treaty brought the Soviet Allied Control Commission to Finland, and fear of the Red Army remained palpable. Separate battalions, including Detachment Martina, was officially disbanded in November. Men who had fought for years in the shadows stripped off their uniforms before demobilization. The long-range patrolmen participated in the military command's most secret operation, the weapons-catching affair. Fearing a Soviet occupation despite the peace, Martina's guerrillas hid vast amounts of Suomi submachine guns, ammunition, and patrol radios in secret underground caches across the countryside, bracing for a war that never came. With peace established, daily life for the patrolmen turned into a nightmare at home. Finland's state police, Valpo, fell under the control of communists and Soviet sympathizers. The Red Valpo began harassing and arresting former long-range patrolmen and weapons cackers. Many of Martina's veterans were harshly interrogated and accused of illegal acts. to avoid falling into Soviet hands or facing Siberian prison camps. Many key men of Detachment Marttina were forced to flee the country via the secret operation Stella Polaris. Under cover of night, they crossed the Gulf of Bothnia to Sweden and moved on to the United States. Major Paul Marttina himself was forced to leave the beloved homeland he had defended. For decades, the incredible feats of the long-range patrolman had to be silenced in public due to foreign policy and fear of the Soviet Union. Veterans could not share their stories with their children, and their heroism was not celebrated. This made them some of the most forgotten and silent heroes in Finnish history, carrying their memories alone. Only after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s was the true honor of the long-range patrolmen restored. Their diaries were opened, and the public finally learned of Detachment Martina's unbelievable endurance. Today, their legacy is honored as part of the great saviors of our independence. This was the complete story of Detachment Marttina, the headquarters long-range patrolmen who marched hundreds of kilometers through the Viena wilds and the Murmansk railway. Their unbelievable endurance, hunger, tolerance, and heroic rescue operations remain unmatched. Thank you for watching this 2-hour feature documentary. Remember to like and subscribe.